No game has it easy going through early access. But when the developers of Astroneer set out to make their space sandbox game, they did not just wind up building a game, they had to build a whole company and procedural generation tech as well. After a few hard-fought years, the Astroneer finally exited early access, and now the devs at Astroneer Softworks are able to look back and understand just what they went through. Recently on the GDC Twitch channel, Astroneer Softworks co-founder Brandon Wilson dropped by far a live stream of Astroneer, breaking down both the theory behind the game's breakable voxel planets and some of the lessons he and his collaborators picked up building up company around early access development. Here are excerpts of that conversation, in Wilson's own words. So there's sort of two things that you touched on there. One is how the artists actually generated the planets and how do they put their artistic touch into this procedural generation system, and also how you mentioned the smooth response to deformation. The terrain systems gone through two major iterations. The system we shipped early access with back in 2016 looked quite a bit different than the system that we have now. The system we have now is way more powerful in terms of the artists getting the look that they want and allowing us to create all the environments that we have now. So the early access aim originally was, we could kind of create the surface of a planet, and we could create a layer of caves underneath the surface, but we could not do much more than that, not easily. It was hard to update without totally breaking people's save games. The new system had the planet is populated with stuff all the way down to the core, and we can create really exotic kind of shapes and biomes, and it's also much easier to update. So we can add and change the algorithms that define the planet landscape without actually breaking people's save games. Both systems share some characteristics. Essentially it's a voxel system, so think of something like Minecraft. The entire world is made up of a grid of 3D voxels, and then each voxel stores certain data, so in our case it lib in density data that defines whether there's ground, there are open air. We define the voxel data and then that voxel data. In a game like Minecraft, once you have your voxels you pretty much have everything. You just render a block where there's a voxel on the block. Hence, typically as in a game like Minecraft, would have an integer index that determines what type of block that is. In our game, because we do not have blocks, we'll have kind of a smooth surface. It's a bit little more complicated. The data's a little heavier. The basic algorithm is that each voxel stores a density value, and that density value has a range, and it can be positive, or it can be negative. If it's negative it means that there's open air. If it's positive it means that there's solid ground in that space. Where that crossover happens between positive and negative is where the surface is going to be. And so we ran that voxel data through a poliginizing algorithm. We use one called marching cubes. It's very common. It's one of the most common we used to do this kind of quick poliginization. And that produces the actual geometry surface that you see on the wheel. Generate collision for that and so forth. So when you are deforming, you are just modifying the voxel data. We do not really have to look at the actual mesh data. We just have to look at the voxel data, apply some transforms to it, so it's subtracting or adding from that density, and then rerun the poliginization for that chunk so the ground is divided into chunks at a certain granularity, so that we do not have to rebuild the mesh for like planet every time. We just rebuild the small area you are standing on, and that's basically how it works. We like to joke that we decided to make the hardest possible game on all dimensions. So like the wisdom, if you go to DD and you talk to a lot of developers, especially indie developers, a lot of the advice is kind of like, pick kind of one thing that you do that's different and focus on that, and everything else just do it away. And we were like, man, in hindsight, we picked the hard way on everything. It's been challenging because, it's procedurally generated, and the challenge there is always, how do you give players a different experience each time they play, but also one that's not completely uniform to the point that it's not completely uniform and drab, and where you have seen one area you have seen them all. Because it's so procedural, and because you can do form all the terrain. A lot of the techniques that AAA games use to make everything run super perfect, which typically involve a lot of offline processing. If you know what your map is going to look like and the layout of your level and all the textures on the meshes that are going to go into it, you can do a ton of offline work, so that the game is relieved of a lot of computations at runtime. You can do light map baking and stuff like that. You can do offline visibility analysis, which means from every point in the level you know what things are visible, so you can really efficiently render. We cannot do any of that in a procedural game, so it makes it really hard sometimes to optimize to the extent that we would like to. And then of course, there's other things, like we have got these huge environments. You are traveling between planets. The planets are spherical, so gravity does not even happen in one direction, which is surprisingly. You do think that that's relatively straightforward. But it's one of those annoying things. But the fact that gravity is typically -1 on the y-axis is hard-coded everywhere, so that becomes a big pain. It's hard. I would say it like doubles the challenge, because when you are working on a game that is unannounced, or is at least not in players' hands, you can't just break everything every day. If something's not working, just completely throw it out, redesign it overnight. When you are in early access, even though the ostensible point of early access is to bring players into a development process where the game is going to be evolving, changing, potentially drastically over time. The reality is you are just in life support mode for a live game, and you have kind of got to treat it that way. And being on X, it meant that we had to go through. It was very, very similar to just being a fully released game. We still had the requirements to go through sort of certification checks to get updates out. We had to have all of our ducks in a row in terms of publishing, in terms of star presence, and then you have a community to manage. And even though you are in early access, people develop their favorite features. It becomes very difficult to make certain changes without disappointing certain people, and the speed at which you can work is definitely slowed down, because each and every update has to keep the game going. You cannot break the game to the greatest extent possible, and we had, throughout early access, kind of a caveat saying that each update has the potential to disrupt your save game. We are not guaranteeing that everything's always fully backward compatible. We had a few updates that were pretty big changes, like we completely changed the base building paradigm at one point, so we had to write some code that would give you some credit for the old base that you had, and that takes some toll on development. I estimate it took us probably twice as long to make this game as we are playing today, as it would if we were not in early access. If we were not trying to sustain the game through monthly, every 6 weeks you have an update. The original way I put this was that it was the only option, the best option we had, to maintain control over development without bringing in a publisher, or something like that. We have a really great community, like a very supportive community, So from that perspective, it's been very nice to learn how to work with our community and learn how to take their feedback. And it's also given us the opportunity to learn. It should be said that when we started, I think when we launched into early access, Systematic was not a company like the traditional sense of a game company. We did not have like an office. We did not have anything. We did not have a QA team. We did not have a support line. It was practically a bunch of guys in like a garage band set kind of thing. The process of early access for us on Astroneer has been as much to build Systematic and learn how to be Systematic as it had to build the game. We certainly do not want to be as closeted as most AAA developers are. We were used to working on teams.